The first item on our list is the router security policy. How many of you have a router security policy? You should. You should also have a switch security policy. You should also have an end user security policy. There are many policies that you will have in your organization identifying what can and cannot be done in regards to the devices or users or services that are being offered. So when you look at the router security policy, what are some of the items that we should consider when we are setting up our routers? Well, first and foremost, passwords. Are the passwords encrypted or not? What is the complexity requirements and settings of those particular passwords? 8 characters, 10 characters? Can it just be letters, or does it have to be letters, numbers? Does it have to be special characters? All of that has to be defined in the security policy before you can deploy a router in your organization. That should be part of that policy. This has to be done before you can deploy the router. How are we going to authenticate? Are we going to use AAA authentication, local database authentication, line authentication? How is that authentication going to occur? Again, another setting that has to be determined ahead of time before you deploy the routers if you want to make sure that you are securing those routers as best as possible. Can you telnet to the device? Hopefully not. Hopefully you're using SSH instead of telnet. What about those unneeded services? Should they still be turned on? For example, is your router an HTTP server? Do you need access to the router using HTTP or HTTPS? If not, shut it off. Don't leave that on if you're not going to be using it, because it just opens up a security hole, creates a vulnerability on that particular router. Filtering. How is filtering done? What are the settings for filtering? Ingress, egress, types of access control lists. What are the procedures that must be followed in order to accomplish that? We are using EIGRP or OSPF or BGP. What are the settings that must be applied? Do you need to use authentication for your routing protocols? Do you have to use the passive interface feature in order to make sure you don't form rogue neighbor adjacencies, out interfaces that are going down to, let's say, the local area networks, and somebody brings in their router and plugs it in? So what are the policies and procedures that need to be in place? Maintenance tasks. What type of maintenance tasks are going to be in place to maintain that particular device? If a change has to happen on the router, what are the policies and procedures that need to be followed in order to make those changes? If you are setting up a new user or making a modification to an interface parameter or modifying a routing protocol, what are the policies and procedures that you have to follow in order to do that? This is important because if you don't follow appropriate change management procedures, then it is possible that you could be performing a task that opens up a vulnerability on your router and could potentially expose your router to a malicious threat. When it comes to router redundancy, what are the routers that are redundantly configured in this case? How is that redundancy configured? Is it hot, always on, active, or is one router a standby? It's important to have all of those listed out, all those policies listed out in advance. When it comes to monitoring, what type of protocols are going to be used to monitor? Are you going to use SNMP to monitor? Are you allowed to use NetFlow? And if there is an incident that occurs, how are you going to handle that particular incident? And lastly, security updates. Our routers are created by humans. The software that's installed on the routers is created by humans. We make mistakes. We know that. Nothing is perfect in this world. That's why we have fixes. It's important for us to monitor and maintain our devices and understand that when there is a vulnerability, that we have to patch that. We have to fix it. You can't go 5 years without patching your devices, because in that 5-year time frame, you have been exposed to many different vulnerabilities that have been fixed. You have just chosen not to fix it. So there has to be procedures in place to make sure that we are constantly following a regular schedule of maintaining the updates, the fixes on our routers to make sure that they aren't being exposed to those malicious users.